Today we're considering 3 chapters from Yahushua, because they're all dealing with the same common theme, the allocation of the territory drawn by lots. These are for the 3 major tribes. At first reading, the drawing of lots seems a rather arbitrary or whimsical way of deciding the future of land inheritance for each of the tribes of Israel. However, when we reflect on the opening words of Yahushua chapter 14, we see that it is a well-ordered and official methodology that is being adopted for the distribution of the land. In chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, we are told, These are the inheritances which the people of Israel took in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the Cohen, Yahushua the son of Nun, and the head of the ancestral tribes, one from each of the tribe of the people of Israel, distributed them by lot to them, and they inherited as Yahweh had ordered Moshe for the 9.5 tribes. So everything was done in complete accordance with the instructions Yahweh had been given directly from Yahweh. Moshe had been given directly from Yahweh. The official panel of arbiters comprises Yahushua as the civil leader, Eleazar as the priestly leader, and they in turn are supported by each of the 12 heads of the tribes. Together they made up the official panel which drew the lot for each of the tribes. Now, returning back to chapter 15, we see that the first tribe to be considered is Yehudah. Verses 1 through 12 give us a detailed account of the territory that was actually being apportioned out for that tribe. As we see from verse 1, part of their southern border was common with that of Edom or Esau, which in and of itself continued to be a problem throughout the Levitical era, which is the period from when they moved into the land until the destruction of the first temple, and also right through the second temple period. The problems that occurred with Edom were continuous. A number of places are named which define the borders, and many of those are long gone. We cannot know for sure exactly where these places were, and many scholars have conjectured about the actual positions. However, suffice to say that the territory was located in the southernmost part of the land of Canaan, from the Dead Sea, forming the eastern boundary, right across to the Great Sea, commonly known as the Mediterranean, which formed the western boundary. The southern boundary was the Zin Desert, south of Kadesh Barnea, where, of course, the earlier generation fell out of relationship with Yahweh. The boundary continued southward until it met the Yadi of Egypt, which is south of the territory of Gaza. Their northern boundary extended from where the Yarden enters the Dead Sea, all the way across the country to the Great Sea. It comprised considerable portions of the southern half of the land of Canaan. Now, verses 20 through 62 list a total of 112 cities, along with their supporting towns and villages. 2 of those cities are conspicuous by their absence from the list. They are Jericho and Ai, both of which had been completely destroyed by Yahushua and his fighting men in direct accordance with the instructions from Yahweh. Now, all the cities and towns and villages that remained became the possession of the clans and family of the tribe of Yehudah. One city that is singled out in verse 12 through 19, Hebron. Abba was the primary character amongst the Anakim, whom the verse says was the father of Anak. In verse 14 it says, Caleb expelled from there 3 of the descendants of Anak. Having vanquished the Anakim from Hebron, Caleb marched to Kiriath Sefer, which is a neighboring city. But he left the conquest of that city to another, who was the son of Caleb's brother, canals. In fulfillment of the earlier oath Caleb had made with his daughter, he would give her as a wife to Othniel, because he conquered that city. So Ashna then said to her father, Caleb, in verse 19, "Give me a blessing. Since you gave me the land in the Negev, also give me a source of water." So Caleb gave her the upper and the lower springs. This was a wise request, given that the land she had inherited from her father, being in the Negev, was parched and dry. That brings us to the end of the territorial allotment for Yehudah. Chapter 15 concludes with something of a footnote in verse 63. As for the Yevusi who lived in Jerusalem, the descendants of Yehudah could not drive them out. So the Yevusi lived with the descendants of Yehudah in Jerusalem to this day. The Yevusi were also known in English translations as the Jebusites. They posed a threat to the people of Yehudah, even down to the time of King David, where, in 2 Samuel chapter 24, we read how David bought the threshing floor, a Yevusi, for 600 shekels of silver. The purchase took place just after David had taken a census of Israel. We will look at that in more detail when we get to it in next year, when we get to 2 Samuel. In the meantime, it is interesting that Yehoshua, having vanquished the 5 kings of the southern region, Yehudah could not remove the Yevusi from Jerusalem. Caleb, with the support of Yahweh, had removed the Anakim, the most despicable of all, from Hebron and the surrounding cities. So why could Yehudah not remove the Yevusi from the city of Jerusalem? Was it possible that until the time of King David, Yahweh did not want that to be his capital? We will again look more closely at that possibility in 2 Samuel next year. So moving on to chapter 16. Having dealt with the distribution of Yehudah, chapter 16 focuses on the apportioning of the territory of Yosef. In verses 1 through 3, it defines the borders that enclosed 2 parcels of land that was set aside for the 2 tribes of Yosef. Then in verse 4 we are told, "So the descendants of Yosef, Manasseh and Ephraim, took their inheritance." Manasseh and Ephraim, as his sons, became Jacob's sons in terms of the inheritance that lay before them. All the rest of Joseph's sons remained as Joseph's sons. Therefore, the rest of chapter 16 is devoted exclusively to defining the boundaries of that territory. But in verse 9, it suggests that the cities were given to Ephraim. And actually, in the part that was given to Manasseh was actually inside the territory of Ephraim. Then in verse 10, we're told that they did not drive out the Canaani living in Gezer. And the Canaani live there together with Ephraim to this day, having to become slaves and do the heavy work. Easier if I read my glasses. Sorry. Israel did not drive out the people, even though Yehoshua had earlier killed Horam, the king of Gezer, who had joined the forces of the king of Lachish against Yehoshua. Both men had been killed. But for some unexplained reason, the people of Gezer were spared, but they later became slaves of Ephraim. Gezer is also mentioned in chapter 21 of Yehoshua as being one of the cities that was given to the Leviim, and it's one of the cities in which the descendants of Levi, or the sons of Levi, Gehat, dwelt to the end of the time when they were in the land. So moving on to chapter 17, the focus now turns to Joseph's firstborn son, Manasseh, who received a divided portion on both sides of the river. Half the tribe had already negotiated with Moshe to stay on the eastern side of the river, provided they fought with the other tribes to conquer the western region. Now, having completed the mission and vanquished the kings in the west of the Jordan, as they had been required to do, they were permitted to return to the chosen eastern portion. Now the chapter 17 begins, considering the allocation given to the family of Machir, east of the river, as he was the grandson of Manasseh, and Gilead became the name of the territory, along with the adjoining territory, which was given from Bashan, the king of Og, the king of the Amori. Now in verse 2, then turns to consider the dividing of the territory on the other side of the river. That's the western side. Lots were drawn for the 6 sons of Manasseh, according to the family sizes. So the western portion fell to Manasseh, was divided into 10 portions. Why? Because one of the descendants had 5 daughters and no sons. So in accordance with the rules that Moshe had laid down in Bamidbar chapter 27 verse 11, each daughter should receive a portion in the name of her father. In all families of Manasseh inherited 6 cities along with their adjoining towns and villages. However, they, like Ephraim, failed to evict the Canaani, who were determined to remain in the land. As the people of Israel grew strong, the remaining Canaani were forced into labor rather than being driven out, as they had been commanded to do by Yahweh through Moshe and Yehoshua. Chapter 17 concludes in verses 14 through 18 with a challenge directed at Yehoshua, where in verse 14 it says, "The descendants of Joseph spoke to Yehoshua. They said, 'Why have you given me only one lot and only one portion to inherit? After all, I am a great people, and since Yahweh has blessed me so.'" 3 times in that verse, that one verse, the singular first person pronoun have been used, which strongly suggests that the descendants of Joseph that are speaking are Manasseh. They are speaking as the firstborn descendants of Joseph, which is correct. They were physically the firstborn. But they fail to recognize the fact that the firstborn double portion was not given to them themselves as a single tribe. It was given to both sons. The one speaking with Yehoshua clearly ignored their forefather Yaakov's intent when he was putting the blessing over their forefather. Manasseh and his brother Ephraim, during the blessing of Joseph by Yaakov, Joseph actually challenged his father because he'd crossed his hands, giving Ephraim the firstborn blessing. Then in Bereshit, chapter 48, verse 19, Yaakov says, "I know, my son, I know it. He too will become a great people, and he too will be great," meaning Manasseh. "Nevertheless, the younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will grow into many nations." In the latter part of Yehoshua 17, verse 14, we see the direct reflection of Yaakov's own words when Manasseh is saying, "After all, I am a great people, since Yahweh has blessed me so." Maybe there was an element of truth in verse 14, giving them the reason to believe that they were a great people, because between the first and the second generations, Manasseh numbers increased by 64%, while Ephraim's numbers diminished by 9%. And that may be a valid reason for demanding that they have the double portion right. However, Yehoshua's response is very interesting when we consider it carefully. In verse 15 he says, "You are a great people. If you are a great people, then go up to the forest, clear the land for yourself, since the hills of Ephraim don't give you enough space." In this verse, Yehoshua is throwing down the challenge in his response. As they are claiming to be a great people, he's giving them a chance to prove themselves. By clearing the land of the forest, they have the opportunity to prove that they deserve the additional land that they would gain. But it is not going to be handed to them on a platter. They have to put in the effort on their part. Their response to Joseph's recommendation is less than desirable when they say, "The hills won't be enough for us, and all the Canaani living in the valley have iron chariots." This is a very defeatist response, particularly following what Caleb had done, almost single-handedly with a few fighting men, when he vanquished the Anakim from around Hebron. If Manasseh is a great people, they should have no problem evicting the remaining Canaani from the territory if they worked with Yahweh. Finally, Yehoshua brings the whole matter to a close by confirming that Ephraim and Manasseh are considered as one through the words of verses 17 and 18. Yehoshua said to the house of Joseph, to both Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are a great people with much power. You'll not have only one lot, but your hills too will be yours. Although it is a forest, you will clear it, and the resulting open land will be yours. You will drive the Canaani out, even though they have iron chariots and are strong." Yehoshua handled this whole matter remarkably well, particularly considering the fact that he himself was actually directly descended from Ephraim. So he's trying to get a balance between these two diametric forces, and he's part of one of them. So he's doing a really good job. The depth of the narrative in just these few verses shows how much of a man of God Yehoshua really was. So having lived through the spy incident along with Caleb, and having come back with a good report, and having delivered the whole of the Canaan into the hands of Israel, he'd proved that he truly was a man working with Yahweh. Those last 5 verses in chapter 17 show clearly how he was able to put aside his human feelings toward the rebellious leaders of Manasseh and work with Yahweh for the greater good of the whole of Israel. Yehoshua and today's parashah. In chapters 15 through 17 of Yehoshua, we've seen how the allocation of the land to those 3 out of the 12 tribes. The allocation began with the tribe of Yehudah. Now he was the 4th child in the line of Yaakov. Then the allocation of the land to the 2 sons of Yosef, bearing in mind that Yosef is the 11th son of Yaakov. So the question must be asked, is there any significance in the supposed random selection of who gets the first lots drawn? When we look at this week's parashah, we see that the first 3 sons of Yaakov, Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, all disgraced themselves in this one parashah. Firstly, in Bereshit chapter 34, we read how Dinah, the daughter of Leah, went visiting the local Canaani girls and ended up being raped and humiliated by Hamor, the son of the local Hivi ruler. In response, her brothers, Shimon and Levi, bring it upon the family great disgrace and shame by their overreaction to the circumstances. Having killed the men of Shechem, in verse 30, Yaakov said to his two sons, "You have caused me trouble by making me stink in the opinion of the local inhabitants, the Kenaani and the Perizi. Since I don't have many people, they will align themselves together against me and attack me, and I will be destroyed, I and my household." The upshot was that the family had to leave the region and move to Beit El. It's some distance from where they were in Shechem. Now the second and third sons had proven themselves to be totally unsuitable to be future leaders of the nation of Israel. Then in chapter 35, following the death of Yaakov's beloved Rachel, he dwelt near Migdol Eder, which is somewhere between Beit El and Bethlehem. It was while they were camped there that Reuben, Yaakov's firstborn, went and slept with Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, Yaakov's concubine, and the mother of Dan and Naphtali. Yet again, a son brought disgrace on the whole family unit. So then if we leap forward to Bereshit chapter 49, when Yaakov is giving his blessings to his 12 sons, all these past actions are brought up again. Firstly, he addresses Reuben in verses 3 and 4. "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, the firstfruits of my manhood. Though superior in vigor and power, you are unstable as water. So your superiority will end, because you climbed into your father's bed and defiled it. Yes, he climbed into my concubine's couch." Then in verses 5 through 7, the words about Shimon and Levi. Yaakov reacts on their joint action against the men of Shechem. Of Shimeon, he says, "Shimeon and Levi, your brothers, are brothers, related in weapons of violence. Let me not enter into counsel with Shimeon, for in their anger they killed men, and in the whim they maimed cattle. Cursed be the anger, for it has been fierce, and their fury has been so cruel. I will divide them," speaking of Levi, "in Yaakov, and scatter them throughout Israel." So Shimon as a tribe diminished greatly between the first and the second generation of Israel, and by the time the territorial portions were given out, they were buried in the midst of the tribe of Yehudah, right down to the south. And the apocryphal Midrash claims that the tribe of Shimeon, at the time of the Babylonian exile, disappeared into beyond the dark mountains of the territory of what we now know as Ethiopia. They never were seen again. So regarding the tribe of Levi, Yehoshua in 14 verses 4 to 5 reiterates what Moshe was told by saying, "Give no portion of the land to the Leviim, except the cities with open land surrounding them for livestock and crops. As Yahweh had ordered Moshe, so the people of Israel did." So all the way through Scripture, we are seeing that there are consequences for the wrongful actions on the part of Israel and Yehudah. Yahweh never lets an error go unchecked. He has always disciplined his people, while at the same time he also gives them certain hope for the future. So what is the future hope for Israel and Yehudah? We have seen how Yehoshua was responsible for drawing the lots, firstly for the two tribal groups ahead of all the other tribes. As we have also seen today, through today's parashah, that the first three sons of Yaakov, by their own free will choice, took matters into their hands and rendered their lives unsuitable and unworthy for future leadership of Israel. leadership and responsibility had to pass through the line of Yehuda. Yet the family of Yosef, through his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, would also feature strongly in the life of Yeshua. That is why we read in Matthew chapter 2, verse 18, a voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and lamenting loudly. It was Rachel, sobbing for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no longer alive. Now, firstly, why Ramah? Was Rachel sobbing and lamenting? Was she doing it at the time of Yeshua, or was she doing it at the time of her death? We don't know. It is most likely that it was Ramah where she died on the journey towards Bethlehem. As we read in Bereshit chapter 35, verse 19, so the children over whom she was lamenting would be those of the family of Yosef. Why? Because many of them had been killed by Herod. Many would have been residing in and around Bethlehem at that time, at the time of the birth of Yeshua. So we see from these words, a lament was taking place in Mattityahu, directly from Jeremiah, chapter 31, verse 14. The prophecy continues on in verses 15 and 16 by saying, this is what Yahweh says, stop your weeping and dry your eyes, for your work will be rewarded, says Yahweh. They will return from the enemy's land, so there is hope for your future, says Yahweh. Your children will return to their own territory. Now these words are reflecting back the words Jeremiah, which we started with, and it starts a long discourse in chapter 30, verse 1 to 3. The words came to Yirmeyahu from Yahweh. This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. Write all these words that I have spoken to you in a scroll. For the day is coming, says Yahweh, when I will reverse the exile of my people, both Israel and Yehuda, says Yahweh. I will cause them to return to the land that I gave their ancestors, and they will take possession of it. It is clear from those words that Yahweh had never forsaken his people, either Israel or Yehuda. Yehuda has already returned to the territory, as given them by Yehoshua. And following the return of Yeshua, Ephraim and Manasseh, along with the rest of the tribes, also will return to their rightful heritage, as Yahweh had promised to Abraham. So we see throughout the pages of Scripture, the sovereign plan of God has always been at work. At every step of the way, the hand of Yahweh has always been on his people, as the sons of Yaakov, along with all those who have actually joined in and become part of the national life of Israel. So whether anyone is from Yehuda, from Israel, or from the nations, we will all be blessed with the original promises that were made to Abraham while he dwelt in the land of Canaan, but only through the work of Yeshua in our lives. Shabbat Shalom.